Good evening, everyone. I am Tishya Majumder, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Oxford University Press. Under this theme, TMYS review December 2022 will explore the role of artistic endeavors of society in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is Pious Renditions through Classical Music and Dance. We are honored to have with us Professor Kaustavi Sarkar, Professor Tsang, and Professor Anupam Mahajan as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. So, Odissi soloist Dr. Kaustavi Sarkar is an assistant professor at the Department of Dance in the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her research employs choreographic analysis within critical theoretical frameworks of South Asian studies, queer studies, religious studies, and digital humanities. Her articles have been published by Research in Dance Education, Journal of Dance Education, Choreographic Practices, and Kairos, a journal of rhetoric, technology, and pedagogy. Her book projects Dance, Technology, Social Justice, which explores Odyssey as a technology of social justice, and Shaping S Curves, Choreographic Process in Odyssey, which explores female choreographers on Odyssey, are in contact with McFarland Publishers and University of North Carolina Press, respectively. Our second speaker is Professor Tsang. Tsang, University of Liverpool, is a conductor, baritone, poet, and producer. He has recently collaborated on albums David Braid, Corona Divine, Misericordi, Twisting Ways, Floor Revisited, Bell Tolls Variations, and premieres the 215 and 9 Dragons Fantasy. His current research relates to innovating the cusp poetic narratives for musical timbre in fluid compositional and performance processes and new resonances, sounds and stories for Zeng heritage, which involves expression of hybridity and pertaining to diasporic identity. And lastly, we have Professor Anupam Mahajan. Vidushi Professor Anupam Mahajan, former head and dean and now the senior most at the Faculty of Music and Fine Arts, University of Delhi, is a rare combination of a teacher, performer, musicologist, author, researcher, research guide, and an able administrator. She is the first and only female artist in top grade of air and TV to perform on 17-fretted sitar of Jaipur Senia Baj, the oldest tradition. She is an author of repute, and out of her 12 books, two have the forewords by Bharat Ratna Pandit Ravi Shankar. She created a new raga, Tilak Des and Kailash Kaun, and a 12-beat Krishna Tal. Besides India, she has also traveled extensively abroad to propagate Indian classical music as an eminent artist and scholar. She is a member of many national and international bodies and received many national and international awards. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. I request Professor Tsang to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. So I'll launch straight in because we only have a certain amount of time to get through what's quite a big topic. And while this topic could be addressed in many different ways, and much depends on which kinds of notions of piety, religiousness, and narrative that you're working from, and indeed what we mean by classical music. Accepting that there is room for debating these terms, and with the caveat that what I say can only ever be a limited perspective on a much wider and complex set of issues, I'd like to begin by addressing the matter from my largely Anglo-European context. In the UK, there is an Institute for Theology, Imagination and the Arts. In an initiative called Theo-Artistry Annunciations in 2016-2017, the Institute sought to confront contemporary matters pertaining to religious piety and classical music. They selected 6 composers to respond to the Old Testament and encouraged them to experiment with the text. The Institute's project raised issues to do with the relationship between the sacred and the secular. It pressed the point that when dealing with sacred subjects, we should not be bound by liturgical function, the function of prayer, but instead move beyond that to consider its presence in secular environments. The composers who engaged in that project discovered issues of translation from religious texts, differences and nuances of translation that led to some new inspirations, new focuses, new musical ideas, and occasionally experimentation with timbres. It was also notable that key artworks, that is, imagery created by very well-known visual artists throughout history, provided another source of inspiration. The intentions of that project were laudable. However, certainly in how that music was reported, it was notable that the musical style of the works fell very much within a church tradition. The sound world was shaped by the forces of that church and the traditions of singing fostered by the chapel choir. As such, the audiences to which those works spoke were narrowly focused to a specific place or specific types of place, and to the specific audiences who frequent those places. Despite suggesting otherwise, the extent to which religious narrative was able to extend into a secular environment was ultimately limited. Now, if I could just go to my presentation, I have a little slideshow here. Yes, so I'm just going to move to this slide here. So more interesting perhaps than what I was just saying there was the underlying philosophy. So George Corbett, one of the lecturers at the Institute, remarked, when music encounters religion, I see the result as being like the scriptural image of water and wine. The art can be transformed and come not to serve theology, but to be theology, or more exactly, theo-artistry, insofar as it may reveal God in a new way through artistry. This idea can be revelatory, but it's not particularly new. Exactly at what point does a rendition or an interaction with theology cease to be theology? When is it simply the servant of theology? One could argue that in the ears and or eyes of the beholder, any pious rendition through music may be read as theology. Is it the case that God, as it were, is revealed through artistic freedoms rather than in spite of them? The revered Scottish composer Sir James Macmillan may agree. He has to some extent spoken on such matters in relation to tradition. He seeks to counteract the idea that religious piety has come to be seen as a restriction to artistic freedom. He rather laments the dominance of revolutionary modernism that emerged in the 20th century, as this effectively caused many composers to self-censure, to deny aspects of their creativity and the religious heritages to which they identify. As he puts it, my analogy is that traditions are rivers which run through history, irrigating human experience at any given point of history. And if you put a dam in that river, you desiccate life, you stop the irrigation. And that was one of the negative fallouts, the negative consequences of revolutionary modernism that tried to stop the influence of the past. Let's take the dam away, let tradition flow. Macmillan's contention that artistic freedom is not constrained by religious narrative does nevertheless raise the issue of how exactly artistic freedom and innovation may be expressed through such narratives. In order to make some headway here, we may consider the matter of tradition in a little more detail. For this, it may be useful to point to comments made by the Dutch composer and author John Boerstler, whose own compositional journey saw him go through modernism to postmodernism to traditionalism. And through that traditionalism, he, like other composers, found the means by which the religious, specifically Christian, facets of life may be effectively expressed. Boerstler says, classical music as a high art genre carried right from the beginning an important religious element at its center. And although the meaning and position of this element changed over time, this element remained at the heart of the art form. The genre, that Western classical music, as we know it today, is the prodigious child of medieval Christian religion, and which is mostly the case with offspring. It always showed traits of its descendants, also when rebelling against its forebears. Apart from its obvious liturgical forms, classical music is not a Christian art form, but in its quasi-secular forms, it shares important characteristics with religion, and especially because the art form we're talking about here is Western, with the Christian religion. In other words, there is an inherent Christian element in classical music, also in its obviously secular and pertinently non-religious forms. Bourslap then goes on to explain 5 characteristic links between the Christian religion and Western classical music as suffering, individuality, the idea of rebirth, aspiration, and ritual. So if we are going to discuss pious renditions through classical music, or this kind of classical music, we need to begin with the acknowledgement that if Western classical music is on some level imbued with characteristics that are shared with Christianity, whatever happens within those pious renditions is not necessarily exclusive to those renditions. What we may be able to say is that those ideas that we have mentioned, suffering, individuality, rebirth, aspiration, ritual, are dealt with in different ways through music. It's a matter of how those ideas interact or are combined, their focus and their framing. In order to communicate those ideas, issues of intertextuality are involved, dialectics between art forms or types, and the real or imagined presence of religiously relevant documents, examples of tangible heritage, as well as aspects of intangible heritage. Perhaps at this point, it may be useful to consider very briefly examples of how 2 different composers approach in principle the same narrative, though we can say it is the same only in the broader sense. It is simply a response to those texts. For this purpose, I've selected 2 very different responses to a medieval poem in which the cross tells the story of Christ's crucifixion. These musical treatments from the 20th and 21st centuries were created some 50 years apart. They are The Dream of the Rood by Howard Ferguson and The Dream of the Rood by John Caskin. Both of the works mentioned are acknowledged as works where the composers were working at the height of their compositional powers. The Ferguson is firmly post-romantic in style and ultimately ecstatic in its overall treatment. In this work, motivic unity dominates over thematic contrast. And as the reviewers at the time put it, it was a work of today speaking in the voice of yesterday. It was considered a profound expression of human hope. And certainly the idea of the triumphant hero, that is, Christ as hero, was made abundantly clear, signified at the point of rebirth by bright fanfares. In this rendition, suffering, individuality, the idea of rebirth, and aspiration are all very present. By contrast, the Caskin, very firmly 21st century in style, is a freer adaptation of the text, and it places its focus on ritual. The concept of ritual has become much more of a concern over recent decades, along with the debating of origins and societal functions. Take, for example, in musicology, Christopher Small's influential studies on the acts of musicking, the focus on rituals and the unpacking of those rituals. In Caskin's Dream of the Rood, we no doubt hear ritual signified in the use of the percussion, the persistent repetitions, returns, and variations. As the veteran music analyst Arnold Whittle put it, the musical forces suggest a harsh concentration on a kind of ritual that resists conventional spirituality while seeking to stare it squarely in the face. The music seems to focus on the weary dirges referred to in the poem. These are, as Whittle puts it, harmonically and texturally dense, refusing to resolve. They are vibrantly earthy, relentlessly hymning the sheer physicality of the original poem's concept, nature, tree, cross, experiencing what the human participants in the drama endure. It is interesting that Caskin's work, his theo-artistry, as it were, is dedicated to the composer Macmillan, who I mentioned earlier, and as such it appears to comment on Macmillan's relationship to the musico-religious. Kaskin's theo-artistry shines a light on the persistence of the musico-spiritual explorers, on those who, like Macmillan, discover their God or spirituality through musical ritual, and specifically not via a depicted God object, nor depiction of a God as hero or conqueror. So that is a very brief discussion of just some of the issues that may be associated with pious renditions through classical music. We've considered the idea of theo-artistry, the place of tradition in that artistic expression, the commonalities between Christian religion and Western classical music, and the types of emphasis on such commonalities that may occur when connecting with or expressing tradition. I hope from the brief examples that I gave, you also have some sense of the value of comparing renditions and responses to a pious text. Such comparisons enable us to see through the play of structures and sonorities how different renditions reflect changing societal preoccupations, and indeed the changing nature of the expression of divinity, of where God or spiritual fulfillment may be found. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. It was a wonderful presentation. I now request Professor Anupam Mahajan to present your views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And I, first of all, convey my thanks for organizing such a wonderful, thoughtful topic. And we generally take music as an entertainment, but no, all music has its roots to the theology. And especially the Indian classical music, it is born out of the religion. The first text that we get to know is the Samved, which is actually the rendition of your Rigved's meters in music. So when Rigved, we did the chanting with three notes, that is Uddat, Anudat, and Swarit. Swarit is the bass note, and Uddat is, which is illumined, which is higher in pitch, and Anudat is, which is lower in pitch. And from these three notes, we got five notes, and then five notes, we got seven notes. So all the scale that we are using today, it has its roots in the religious text Samved. So music is nothing but the evolvement through the religion, especially in a country like India, where you can trace back the history, you can go back and you can associate yourself with the origin of the music. Generally, people say there are many mythological stories also that Narad, he went from heaven to earth and he propagated music taking tumru, that is one string veena. But when we talk about the research, then we come to know that all those things are also reflected in our texts. We can see them in our text, and simultaneously in Vedas, we also find that whenever the rituals took place, there was singing by the priest and there were also dances by the apsaras. So those dances were very poised. They were not erotic dances, they were for the religious ceremonies, they were for making the god and goddesses happy. So when we were doing that thing, so music in India has always been a spiritual base, having a spiritual base. Why? Because music, um, that thought of music, the main communication of music is through sound. And sound in India is taken as the concept of Om. Om is that realizing you are a part of a God. We all think in Indian mythology that we all are a part of God, and our soul has separated from God, and we are looking forward to again unite with the Supreme. So when we talk about that, the whole universe, its existence is through the sound. So in Indian system, we have two kind of sound, that is Ahat and Anahat. Ahat is which is produced by the human being, which is produced by any efforts. But anahat is which is already existing in the universe. So that sound, if you put your hands in your ears, you will see that humming sound. So that sound is the main source for the salvation. So we try to reach that sound through our meditation, through our concentration, and through our discipline. And when we talk about meditation and concentration, even till today, what we are doing is all spontaneous production of our emotions. I will come to this later. I'll move systematically from here. Uh, when we talk about origin from the Samveda, the music developed its two forms. That was Gandharv and then Gan. Gan was for the common people to enjoy music, and Gandharv was only for the god and goddesses, and only the music that could reach you to the god and goddesses. And similarly, the two forms further developed, Margi and Desi. Margi was chanting and doing it for pleasing the god and goddesses, pleasing in the sense for unification of your soul to them, not pleasing it just for buttering, but unification of your soul to the supreme. And then there was Desi, that was being used for different human anthropological units, and that was for expressing their different forms of needs, because any culture is always imparted through their habits, through their beliefs, through their customs, and through their thought process. And music is always a very integral part of any culture. And India, being a country with such vast anthropological um, I would say, anthropological way of dealing and expressing music. Every state has their own music, where the rituals with the god, all the ceremonies of the god, all the festivals of related to the god, the birth of a child, the all the sanskaras, what we called it sanskaras. There are 16 sanskaras. All sanskaras are given way to the music, and they are expressed through the music. The chanting is done in such a way so that the essence of their sanskaras is embodied in the human being. And when we moved further, the first book on Indian music is Natya Shastra. And Natya Shastra is basically on a Natya, but it gives the very elaborate sense of the music. And very important aspect of music, that is rasa theory, is discussed over there. They say, what is ras? Ras is a matter of relishment, when you are relishing something. The similarly, they say the taste of ice cream or taste of gulab jamun or taste of any kheer, because since it is a international, I would say, pastry, or taste of ice cream is very different, though they all are sweet. But very important aspect, what Bharat has said here, is that you should be a tension free human being if you want to relish any kind of a music, whether it is for the spiritual purpose or whether it is for your own self improvement. So what he says is, when ingredients, and he gives a very simple example with all the food, because food, whatever country it may be, whatever time it may be, whatever age it may be, the sweet remains sweet for all countries, for all days, for all times, and sour remains sour for everyone. So he says, when the exact proportion of ingredients are put and a very tasteful dish is created, and when that dish is relished by a person who is tension free, the kind of a pleasure he gets, that is rasa. So when we come to in terms of music, then all the ingredients of music has to be in accurate proportion to create a aesthetic appealing music piece, and which is relished by your soul,
who is tension free, who is not having any tensions in mind. Because if you are preoccupied with your tensions, half the time you are not listening what the other person is saying. So when a tension free mind relishes that, so that gives a nourishment to your soul, that gives you the power to enlightenment your soul, and ultimate purpose of your soul is to unite with the supreme. So when we went further, all art forms change. So music also went through the changes. And from Gandharv, we went to Margi, and from the Margi, the different musical forms were developed, which were called Prabandh. Prabandh means that something is managed. Something is managed in the sense what Bharata says, that everything has to be in proper ingredients. So, similarly, all the ingredients of music, that is the notes, the metric cycle, the words, they all were fixed. So different varieties of prabandhs were created, and there was no latitude given to you while rendering those prabandhas. And from those prabandhas, we evolved certain other musical forms like Drupad. Drupad means a fixed um, piece of poetry which is totally fixed in its meters, in its notes. Again, you cannot do any variation in that. It is fixed, and you renderation of that is done in such a manner that you get a feeling of a purity of sound. There is very little, yeah, I will say, way of lightly dealing it. There's total sobriety in that. Total majestic flavor is that. Just the way you're dealing with the God. You cannot be light with the God. You're always in a very majestic flavor. So those forms of musical pieces were developed. And music, when developed on its own, it started using its own techniques. Own techniques in the sense vocal music developed with different musical forms like Dhrupad, like Khayal. Khayal means imagination. You give the power to the artist to on the spot create everything except for the composition, all the rendering of the raga. Raga is a music entity, it is a melody, it is melody based. So that means that one note is handing itself to the other note, and other note is taking it from the previous note. It is not that three or four notes are being played together, not like harmony, but it's a sequence of notes which create a musical thought, and that thought has to be maintained while rendering those ragas. So those ragas, when you deal, you have a lot of rules and regulations. So that means again you are in imbibed by the rules and regulations. So these ragas, some of them also have the names by god and goddesses like Durga, Shri, Bhageshwari, Bhairavi. Bhairav is a very serious lord in Indian mythology. So these names, and you treat them similarly. Accordingly to their names, they are being treated. So there are a lot of names and lot of their treatment, musical note, how it is treated. That is the main ingredient in making different musical forms and musical styles in instrumental. And somewhere in the medieval period, instrumental music developed its own style. It deviated from the vocal music, and with its own stroke patterns, with its own techniques, it developed its own musical style, which is known as Masid Khanigat, which is again a very serious rendition. Serious rendition, applying notes are very serious over there, and then Raza Khanigat, which again has fixed bowls, fixed stroke patterns. You cannot deviate. So when you cannot deviate, that means you are being guided by those force. And music in the medieval period also came into context for the entertainment. But entertainment music remained on one side. Today the topic is on the religious music, so I'm sticking to that. The lighter forms of music, they came in the form of bhajan, kirtan, temple music, and then from temple music we had developed a music Haveli Parampara, which is still being used in Radha Krishna temples in you can say at different places which are dominating Nathdwara. You are using a lot of Haveli Sangeet, and even in Vrindavan, Haveli Sangeet is being used, which is a serious way of reciting in front of the God, in front of the God, praising the God, and trying to please the God so that they give you the permission for your soul to unify with them. So this kind of a treatment of music is in practice even today. So when we talk about different varieties of music that we are dealing today, they are the, and every household is dealing that. The bell, the bell while doing a puja, while doing your normal religious things in the morning is being used. You're using cymbals to do your prayers. So every household is using that in India. And when we talk about that, bhajan is a unification, identifying yourself with the supreme. And even the small child and everything like Aarti, Om Jai Jagadish Hare, I think so every Indian person knows Gayatri Mantra. Now we are reciting these things with the musical rendition because it is more easily reachable to the society, and society together can unite to reach the supreme. Ultimate aim of Indian mythology is to unite with the supreme. And similarly, bhajans and kirtan, you can have the bhakti movement came in the 15th 16th century. Even the Guru Granth Sahib, the religion of Sikh dharma, has every var designated to the raga. So every rag has different emotions attached to it. According to those emotions, according to the notes used, according to the application of notes, according to the stress given, according to the applicability of different phraseology in the same scale, you have different ragas, and those ragas have emotional values. And according to the time theory is only observed in Indian classical music. We have ragas for the morning. That means when the sun is rising, the energy is very different. You have very different energy. It is like your notes are coming from the infinite sa. But while using in the evening, the same notes are applied in a very different manner to give you the feeling of the dawn of, and your dusk. You are going now, your sun is now going into the horizon. The same way, all the notes they come to the sa, they unite with the sa. Like Shri Rag, you can say, is for the evening, and similarly, Bhairav is for the morning, where the energy is different, where your energy while rendering Shri is different. So, when we talk about Kirtan, Bhajan, nowadays a Sufi music is very popular. It is not that it is only for the Muslims or there are Urdu words and that. Sufism is when you are trying to unite with the supreme, like we say Om. The minute you say this, that means all negative thoughts are going away. You cannot think anything, but you are only identifying with yourself. All the audience, all of you can try this. When you try this, you will be identifying it with yourself. You are going inner. And similarly, when you say Allahu Akbar, you are again identifying yourself. So these are the different language words that are being used, but the meaning remains the same. So I will just play a small piece of Sufi music, which belongs to Punjab. I belong to Punjab, and Punjab is using Bhairavi. That means notes are used, and second and third and seventh, sixth and seventh notes are flat in that. So all those notes are flat. Story behind this music piece that I created is that when we were child, one person, one Sufi person used to go in our lane and always sing on a one string tambura, which Narad played. He sang on that tumba vajda ye naal mere, matlab that tumba is being played with the rhythm of your breathing, and that rhythm is saying that whatever deeds you are doing today, don't try to do bad deeds, because ultimately your soul is going to unite with the supreme. So that had left so much of impact on me. Every evening used to come, and when I went deeply into music, I created that piece he used to sing on the Sufi Museum. And I'll just play that piece for 1 or 2 minutes and then conclude my saying on that. So this is based in Rag Bhairavi, which says, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very enlightening to hear you speak as well as your performance.
I can't
I
hear
now,
you.
am I audible? I am, okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. So now I request Professor Kaustavi Sarkar to present your views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Tell me your story. Um, my presentation will be around this idea of distillation of the social through the arts, the idea of the transformative potential embedded in the theo-artistic phrasing of Professor Lee Tsang, or within the beautiful rasic phrasing of Professor Anupam Mahajan. So, I am a practitioner scholar, I'm an Odissi dancer, and I encountered sadhana as daily dance practice. And I encountered this term in a very secular dimension. However, today, as a scholar, as an educator, affiliated to higher education in the United States, I encountered this term philosophically, ritually, as well as experientially, being a practitioner scholar, being interested in the potential of the arts for perhaps spiritual emancipation or for emancipation and freedom in general. So, my question remains in this unnecessary binary of the sacred and the secular that Professor Lee Sang also mentioned. So, I encounter Odyssey through the prism of bhakti, Bhakti is this idea of complete surrender, prapatti, complete devotion. Um, so then I also encounter sadhana, the term of daily dance practice, also as a way or methodology of spiritual practice. So in Advaita Vedanta or non dual philosophy, I encounter this term called Chatushtaya, or this fourfold path to freedom. This idea of viveka or discrimination, vairagya or detachment, and then the Shat Sampatti, Shama, controlling sense organs, Dhamma, controlling actions, Uparati, withdrawal from the world, Titiksha, spiritual fortitude, Samadhana, focus, and Shraddha, a working hypothesis of devotion, of bhakti. All of this is towards mumukshatvam, which is this idea of freedom. Now, this really almost philosophically premises my practice in Odyssey. The Odyssey repertoire has 5 elements: Mangala, Charan, Batu, Pallavi, Abhinaya, Moksha. And this is also known as Margam, which is the spiritual path, or the Sadhana Chatushtaya one can encounter in Advaita Vedanta, in philosophy. So, Mangala Charan is invocation. Batu notes the fundamentals of the dance form, the instruments that are used, the ornaments that are worn. Pallavi is melodic as well as rhythmic proliferation. Abhinaya is elaboration into the depths of rasa, the nourishment that Professor Mahajan was talking about. One can see its fruition within Abhinaya or storytelling. And then the whole idea of this is the notion of moksha, which is spiritual emancipation. Now, the idea of transformative potential through moksha, through mumukshatvam, is very interesting to me. And I really think hard as to how I can make it relevant to an audience. To an audience of students, as well as to an audience of cultural outsiders who are not necessarily encultured through these processes, through these ideas. So I question myself. I think how I can spiritualize the secular and how I can secularize the spiritual, or I can transcend this binary. This binary does not hold true in the first place, I believe. And I feel through the art and social endeavors, right? How can ideas of touching bodies, minds, hearts, souls, how can the spiritual impact of Odyssey, of the movement, can can reach broader audiences towards perhaps social justice issues, towards perhaps social endeavors? That's also a part of Tell Me Your Story um, sort of ethics. So on April 30th, 2019, in my university, there was a mass shooting incident, and America is sort of unfortunately notorious for these sorts of incidents. So I was wondering how uh, I can explore this tension that I see, the loss of youth potency, the loss of life, and how through my South Asian aesthetic, I can live this tension of the grotesque, how I can sort of share my visceral reaction to this ethical dimension. And I am not a cultural insider to, I'm very much rooted in my South Asian heritage and practice, but yet I wanted to experientially encounter as well as present to a larger audience. So I created a documentary slash dance film called Pukar, Calling for Justice, and this was directed by Toby Shearer. And I would be honored if Tishya, you can please share this movie with our audiences here, and I shared this in the chat as well. Over to you, Tishya.
Yes, ma'am, we are putting it up.
Thank you.
undisguised, delicious eats. Every ingredient unclouded.
I guess we're having some network issues. We are trying.
It is important to think about the moment we are. So arts needs to really think through its relevance, its impact. Pukar, calling for justice, continues to be my metaphorical exploration towards the menace of gun violence. So Odissi is an Eastern Indian classical dance form from the Eastern Indian state of Odisha. It is interesting and important to see how the form that I'm invested in can speak to issues such as gun violence, can speak to issues such as racial discrimination, can speak to issues such as gender and sexuality discrimination. The way I teach Odyssey, I think of three predominant principles. I think of isolation, where your torso is going in one direction, your eyes and neck are going in the other direction, while your hands and feet are doing something completely different. Also opposition, where your torso and your neck are in a measured but opposite I see the third principle as coordination, where you're coordinating your footwork to the percussion instrument, the mardala, and whereas the upper body is literally tied to the melodic modes or the raga. All of that is a lot of tension in the body that I feel is potent and channeling towards a social justice cause. This piece, Pukar, calling for justice, the movements have come out through this idea of tension and struggle that people are facing as they are encountering this absolutely new technique. My students have been my co-creators. Because we were in a moment of pandemic and a social upheaval, I wanted the students to really address their moments. I would take those movements and make it Odyssey-esque and give it a tone, give it a color that would connect the entire movement back to my research and my ideas around this moment of loss of youth potency to the pandemic of gun violence. Hide, run, fight. Hide, run, fight. That incident taught me a lot. It has continued to be in my consciousness and in my artistic psyche. The importance of
Yeah, I think the network is very bad. We are still trying.
Well, I mean, we can stop there if the network is a trouble. But I think I can, in closing, just mention um, how this idea of spiritual freedom, spiritual emancipation, that's ingrained within the structure, the sonority, the embodiment, the expression, how can that be channelized towards inspiring larger audiences, inspiring greater change? Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very illuminating video, as well as your presentation was very amazing. We'll now move on to our question answer session. And my first question is to Professor Kaustavi Sarkar again. Classical dance is essentially connected to divinity and hence brings before our eyes the impact of religion on the society. Focusing on this aspect, could you elaborate on how classical dance reflects the social and power structure as well as the moral values of our society?
Thank you for that question. You might want to close the video down that way.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Um, so the question in terms of the divine origins and the religiosity in movement, and how can that reflect the socio-political, the moral, and the ethical dimensions. I think it's a very, very large question, and I don't know where to start and where to end. Um, in terms of the 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 sort of divine origins, I think Professor Mahajan already mentioned Natya Shastra, and the genealogical trace of Odyssey is also made to Odra Magadhi, the word Odra Magadhi, the dance of Odra Magadhi, to that was mentioned in the Natya Shastra. However, we do have practitioners, lineages of practitioners, the Maharis, or the temple artists, who have been appointed in the Jagannath temple of Puri since the 12th century. And we have Gotipuas, young prepubescent boys dressed as girls, who used to dance outside the temples in ritual practice since the 16th century. So you do have the combination of religion and ritual in the immediate histories of Odyssey. And the values that are embedded in them is the first value is, I guess, the cyclical nature of time, right? The creation and the dissolution and the coming back again. So the cyclical nature of the time, but also the social aspects. A lot of Odyssey movement is carved around Oriya femininity, regional gender aspects. I remember hearing stories of how the lineage of Odyssey that I do, Guru Keluchran Mahapatra style of Odyssey, how that style, how Guruji himself would do sort quote unquote ethnographic research, participant observation research, where he would look at women folk in the villages, and how he would bring those and distill that in the movement. So thinking of the regional dimension, the social dimension, as well as the gender dimension. And then definitely the whole idea of monarchy and state patronage, all of that is huge. Odyssey has had the luxury of being supported by kings, right? So the monarchs. And then today, post independence, we have Odyssey as the heritage project, as this classical art form, which where the classical artists also become brand ambassadors of the nation, right? So we represent the regional, but we also represent the nation in a light that is deeply spiritual and deeply historical, but also that that enjoys state patronage. For example, the status of a folk, or a folk art, is perhaps not at par with that of the state patronage that we enjoy. So the idea of I think the last thing I'll say is this idea of religiosity and divinity. And I think pluralism. Pluralism is the essence of Odyssey or any art form, because the diversity of the socio-cultural diversity embeds itself, marks itself within the form. So we have Vaishnavite influence, we have Shaivite influence, we have Shakta influence, we have Tantric influence, we have Advaita influence, Achinta Bhedaved influence, we have bhakti movement infused within the Gita Govinda lyrics, and as we render it today. So I'll stop there. I think one can write multiple dissertations and books on this, just in case of Odyssey. Thank you.
So Odyssey does reflect the various aspects of our society. We can
Absolutely.
conclude that.
And not just reflects, refracts, and transforms and
Refracts, yes.
constructs all of it.
Yes. Okay. My second question is to Professor Lee Tsang. Due to the advancement of technology, music is now being composed digitally as well. Could you tell us about the use of digital instruments and its intersection with classical music? And how might such an intersection be relevant for the portrayal of religious narrative?
Okay, well, thank you very much for that question. Well, from my perspective, or what I think is particularly relevant to the portrayal of religious narrative, I would say there are two key points to make about this. The first relates to digital manipulation. That is what is possible now as a result of being able to modify sounds that are, say, sampled or synthetically created. And the other relates to digital versions of acoustic instruments. So if I start with that first point, let's say that a novel timbre can be created by making, say, a recorded flute sound large and spacey, or enable it to play things that a human being on a real flute can't play. There then becomes this possibility for conveying a sense of otherworldliness, which can engage the senses and, in the right context, can have, let's say, a spiritual effect. I was involved in a project, an album, Corona Divine Misericordiae, where we used digital technology to play a role in creating psycho-spiritual sonorities that framed peace and helped feed into a narrative of Saint Faustina and the Divine Mercy. How exactly those sounds are read by an audience is open to debate. I'm just going to send you a video there, just a little link of some of the music that I'm just referring to here. So we had a sample of recorded whispers whirling around the orchestra.
Will I play it?
Yes.
I'll just share my screen? Okay, okay.
Yeah, if you can. If it's too tricky, don't worry. I could. Shall I carry on talking while you try to do that? Maybe. But anyway, I was just going to say we had this sort of sample of recorded whispers whirling around the orchestra, and this could be taken as symbolism of a kind of presence that the forthcoming prayer responds to. And that effect and the way it was layered into the composition was possible because of the technology used to record and mix. And there was a sort of stereo field that was used to move the voices around as if to convey the idea of flight. And some people may take this as, let's say, the depiction of evil spirits swirling around. Others may take it as voices within the imagination. It all depends on which reading or position you take on Saint Faustina and her reported visions. I do think there is a power in ambiguity, and if we are entirely literal, there isn't much music or real potential for spiritual fulfillment in it. There has to be either in the sound and or its context a means by which the imagination has an opportunity to question, to formulate possibilities. So anyway, that was the first part that I was referring to. And then the second part was relating to the power of technology in relation to specifically digital instruments that relate directly to existing physical acoustic instruments. And it's really that they can conjure up sounds of religious ritual, or there is the potential for the relationship between the ritual and the non-ritual to be blurred within a sort of timbre space, and for a range of different significations to be the result. Digitization of instrumental sounds can enable configurations that are not bound by the physical limitations of non-digital instruments. So an instrument that normally requires 5 people to play, as in the case of a bianzhong, can be played by just one person. And the new proximity of pitches enables combinations and successions of pitches and harmonies that may not otherwise have been possible. While there may be creative positives here, the possible downside is that this may erode too far the connection with the non-digital version of the instrument and its usual specific powers of signification. So the limitations of an instrument are not only part of the structure of the instrument, but part of the structures of the music that are possible from it. So I would think when using a digital instrument in the compositional process, a necessary awareness of those original instrument limitations can increase the potency of how the composer can signify the musical structures associated with the original instrument, and in turn, how the composer may use sound to signify various social, including religious and political structures or narratives. And this is not to say that the composer should always be bound, but they should be informed and may choose to be bound. And they will need to exercise careful judgment as to the narrative and social impacts of how and when they choose to be released from those bounds. I said enough. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We are trying to play the video.
All right. Don't worry.
Just a lot of network issues going on. We're still trying.
Yeah, don't worry. So yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. My question is to my next question is to Professor Anupam Mahajan, but I don't know if she can hear us. Professor Mahajan, am I audible to you? Ma'am, can you hear me? I think I'm not audible to her. Let me just connect to her once. Professor Mahajan, am I audible to you? Okay. Okay. I'm just connecting to her. Okay. All right.
I think so. There's some. Can you hear me, Trisha?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay. I can hear you now.
I can't hear you, but well, I got your question. Can I go ahead? Just nod.
Okay.
Okay.
My question to Professor Mahajan is that could you elaborate on the various Indian classical musical instruments and their connection to deities? What do these instruments symbolize in mythological stories? Ma'am, you can answer. I think she's having network issues. Okay, let's just wait for 2 minutes if she can come back.
Yeah, can you hear me, Trisha?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Hello,
Ma'am, you're audible. We can hear
you
you.
can hear me? Okay. So all the deities that are connected with the music have with the religion. Sorry, I can't hear you. There's some
We're okay.
internet problem. So
I think there's some major internet issues going on today. Okay, so I'm just trying to share my screen to see if we can play your videos.
Don't worry if you can't hear it. We could just skip. It's no problem. It was just a quick demonstration. It's no problem.
So, Professor Lee Sang, we just played your video successfully this time.
Yeah, I'm not. Well, I'm not sure. Well, I think you could hear it, but maybe no one else could. I think we couldn't hear it actually.
Oh,
Uh,
oh no.
yeah,
This is such.
honestly, don't worry about it. Just let's move on. It's fine. The moment's gone. It's no problem.
Okay. Okay. I'm just trying to play Professor Kaustavi's video. Please let me know if it is audible.
I would suggest Tishya to move on because the network is poor. So let's move on
Yeah.
with the questions to in the interest of time.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Okay. So my next question is to Professor Kaustavi. Could you shed some light on how the expression of gender and sexuality in classical dance dismantles the foundation of binarism in our society?
Again, you know how to ask very hard questions. Um, so dismantle is a very strong word. I would say the classical forms, at least Odyssey, I can speak from experience. The gender binary holds strong. Yet I could definitely say that the vocabulary, right, the basic moves, the elements, the foundations, the grammar, the syntax, the way the grammar is, the pathos and the way the syntax is, where the basic moves are joined, and then the style, the individual choreographer style, the individual composer style, the individual artist's dancer style, all of those are irrespective of any gender conventions. So basically a little example would be, women, female identified, we use this, whereas male identified, they use the suchi mudra a little bit in the front. So but then often many dancers do this as well, so it's not a hard and fast situation, it's almost a question of choice. So the framing conventions of the gender binary are very lucid that way. It's not gender based. For example, I'm simplistically noting that ballet, that the technique is gender specific. women learn on point, and men learn to sort of go the ballon, the large leaps and jumps and the splits and whatnot. So, but in any case, historically also we see the Gotipoa experiment, right, where we have young prepubescent boys, they dress up as girls. And the idea is, the idea in this particular Odyssey, I would say, historically and regionally speaking, from the state of Orissa and the eastern region of India, is the bhakti influence, the influence of the bhakti movement, where all humankind is seeped in the Radha Bhava, in the Sakhya Bhava, right? Where you sort of accept the complete surrendering attitude, the the complete sort of offering of the soul at the feet of, and that relationship of the human, the mundane with the spiritual, that relationship is feminized, is gendered. So it's Radha and Krishna. Gita Govinda, which is the seminal text in Odyssey, Abhinaya, Odyssey expression, Odyssey storytelling, you have that metaphor of surrender, and then that is a gendered dimension. So dismantle, I would say, is perhaps a very strong word, but then complicate, for sure. Definitely, the complications are very evident. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaustavi Sarkar. So my second question to Professor Lee Tsang is, could you discuss any especially striking uses of classical music in films that address religious themes or narratives?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, for me, probably the most striking example is Andrei Tarkovsky's The Sacrifice. I don't know if you know that film. I wish I could play you a bit, but let's not go there. Let's not worry too much about that. But there's an awful lot one could say about that film and about how it combines faith systems and how music is used to signify that. But I would say the most powerful uses occur as a result of how Tarkovsky frames the film. So he has this technique where he basically uses this one of the most heart-wrenchingly beautiful pieces of music by J.S. Bach. So this is a piece called Erbarme dich, and it's from the St. Matthew Passion. And it has this wonderful violin solo and this mezzo-soprano voice singing these very long phrases, pleading for mercy, and it takes a sort of long time to get to a resolution. And this is used in the opening credits, and the drama associated with this music and these pleas for mercy is, in terms of the religious aspect, is Peter's denial of Christ and all of the emotions relating to betrayal and sacrifice associated with that. Now we hear this music when it is combined with an image of Leonardo da Vinci's The Adoration of the Magi at the birth of Christ. So basically, these artworks, visual and musical, are put in dialogue with each other. They emphasize that tragedy, and the rest of the film plays out the sacrifice of a philosophical man who must make a sacrifice in order to bring together faith systems and save the world from World War III. So in the process, he commits to burning down his house and sacrifice his own place within society. And right from the very outset of the film, the emphasis is on the importance of ritual. So I mentioned about ritual earlier, but here this involves the protagonist planting and watering a tree in conversation with his grandson, who he calls Little Man. And if we skip to the end of the film, we return to the image of that tree with a boy, Little Man, observing the ritual of watering it. And then afterwards, he lies beneath the tree and looks up and quotes from the book of John. And he says, "In the beginning was the word. Why is that, Papa?" And then as we hear we hear on the soundtrack, Erbarme dich, that same piece I mentioned earlier, being sung, and the image pans upward very, 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 very slowly. And what this encourages the viewer to do is to follow the trajectory upwards. So like when you're watching it, you kind of move your head upwards to the top of the screen. So Tarkovsky is pulling us upwards beyond the top of the screen so that the viewer's head and eye line are looking towards the heavens. And he does this at the same time that these beautifully long musical phrases with their delayed harmonic resolutions are happening. And partly because we heard the music before, we are primed for having some embodied memory of these phrases, and partly because these are long, long phrases, he maximizes the possibility that the viewer's breath will be affected in sympathy with the sound. And certainly as a singer myself, the control of my breath does establish a connection here. So the listening becomes almost literally breathtaking when combined with this slow, long panning and manipulation of the head and eye line. So after having this experience as a viewer and listener, this experience then on reflection speaks to that opening image I described earlier at the beginning of the film. We see in that image the tree under which the Christ child sits on Mary's lap, and then there's one of the Magi with his head craned upwards towards the tree and the child, and he's handing a gift to the child and is touched by the hand of the child. So it's almost as though Tarkovsky is using the medium of the film, of which the use of classical music is a part, to somehow make the viewer physically identify with the character in the painting and potentially be part of that audiovisual composition by being both in the screen and outside of it. So the viewer-listener becomes this sort of active participant. And, at the beginning of the talk that I gave earlier, I mentioned the notion of theo-artistry, and I would say that I could think of no better example of that in action than this film, and indeed that moment that I was just trying to describe as well there. Anyway, I spoke for quite a long time there. Thanks.
No, sir, it was very nice to hear you speak. Thank you so much, sir. Professor Mahajan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. So my question to you was, could you elaborate on the various Indian classical musical instruments and their connection to deities? What do these instruments symbolize in mythological stories?
See, like I told you earlier also, that when we say Narad, Narad is a very important figure in our mythology. And it is said that music was brought to the earth from the heaven by him, because he was wandering all the time from the earth and heaven, and he was playing tambura, that is one string instrument. So it is very strongly connected with him. And the goddess of learning, Saraswati, goddess of learning, uh, she is associated with Veena. Veena is known as the mother of all instruments. All instruments, all string instruments, they have been evolved from Veena. So Veena is a mother, and different variety of all those instruments today you see, they are developed from different varieties of Veenas. We have n number of varieties of Veena, so they have developed from there. And when we talk about the wind instruments, Lord Krishna is very famous, and the flute, that is very much associated with him. And flute is the first instrument, wind instrument, which came by nature. When you go to the jungles of these bamboo trees over there, when they have hollow in that, any hole in that, you will see that in that jungle you get many kind of sounds, the whistling sounds. So when this piece is taken from its bamboo and dried and then seasoned, and according to the musical notes, it is holes are built up, and when the wind passes through that, it is a first wind instrument that nature gave to us, and that is very much associated with Lord Krishna. So anytime you talk that he played his flute and he brought so many sakhis around him, so that is the impact of flute. And when we talk about percussion instruments, Lord Shiva, he is the energy. We refer him as energy. So it can be a positive energy also, it can be a negative energy also. That is why we always say when he opens his third eye, that means he wants to bring the destruction. So he's always connected with Damru, that is the percussion instrument. He's always connected with that, and so is connected with Vishnu, who is the creator of this universe. Brahma is the creator of this universe. We, in our mythology, we say that this universe has been created by Brahma. So he's again referred with a conch. That is again a blowing instrument. You blow air into the conch and then it sounds. And reincarnation of his, yeah, Lord Krishna, he is again playing the wind instrument. So this way you see that all varieties of instruments are being used by all our lords. We personify them with these instruments, and that is how we think that they have been come into our use in our that mythology has taken place with the religion, and that religion has followed that flow of music even today.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahajan. So, with
Thank
this,
you.
we now come to the end of today's session. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Kaustavi Sarkar, Professor Lee Tsang, and Professor Anupam Mahajan for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, good night from India.
Good night, ma'am.
Bye.